Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to this debate on exploring alternative financing in developing countries. And congratulations to those of you that survived the intensive debate and discussion that's been going on over the past 2 days, and I hope you're going to get a lot out of this discussion as well. We're here to discuss the topic of exploring alternative financing in developing countries, and we'll be talking about alternative financing in the sense of different to mainstream government financing and different to mainstream and traditional, if you want to call them that, donor financing. Just talking with the panelists, we felt very strongly to emphasize that this is not instead of government financing, this is additional. But how can we find those new sources of financing that actually help to promote predictability, transparency, accountability, and crucially for this meeting, innovation in the education sector? It's a key topic, and here to discuss the topic, we've got a great panel who have had many, many years of experience working on these issues. Dr. Yero Balde is the lead policy advisor to the Vice President for Sector Operations at the Africa Development Bank, one of the major investors in development in the African continent. Prior to that position, he was the Chief Socioeconomist at the Africa Development Bank, responsible for managing growth and social protection in the bank. And prior to that, Dr. Balde worked in the government in Gambia, so he's seen donor financing on both sides of the table, if you like. Our second panelist is Mr. Iqbal Noor Ali, who is the senior advisor to the Aga Khan Development Network, one of the largest development agencies supporting education, health, environment, and many other development projects across the world. Aga Khan Development Network provided over $600 million in support of such projects in 2010, making it one of the largest sources of alternative financing, if you like, for development. And finally, our last panelist is Dr. Rong Wang, who is the founding director of the China Institute for Education Finance Research in Peking University. She has written many books and articles on this topic and is recognized as one of the leading scholars in the field of education finance in China, particularly advised the government on innovative approaches of designing free rural compulsory education policies and several other important education finance policies in China. So I'd like now to welcome the panelists and ask them to join me on this platform. Divided into two sections. We'll have a debate for 45 minutes or so amongst the panelists, and I'll ask them some questions to get the ideas going. And then we'll have lots of opportunities for a question and answer with participants in the room. And just to remind everybody that you can also participate, and participants online on the MyWise website and through Twitter with the hashtag that's there on the screen. And last practical reminder that if you're using your headsets, please do not place anything in front of the remote, have it facing the stage so there's no electronic interference. So, without further ado, let me throw the question open to the panelists, and perhaps Yero, start with you and ask you to give us some examples of your experience of working and helping to deliver alternative sources of financing for education, and what's worked and what hasn't worked. Yero.
Thank you very much, Desmond, and of course, let me take this opportunity to thank WISE and the Qatar Foundation for giving us the opportunity to participate in this important summit. Before also going to the topic, I also want to briefly put the discussions into context by giving you a quick overview of what the African Development Bank is, for the benefit of all those who don't know. We are, a multilateral development bank. I'm responsible for financing development operations in Africa. We have the entire African countries as members. There's 54 African countries and 25 non-regional members. And we do financing in the form of concessionary loans, non-concessionary, but as well as grants as well. Coming back to the issue of financing of education, I will talk in using three perspectives. One is on the issue of first coming to the issue of domestic resource mobilization, because we strongly believe that the most predictable and sustainable source of financing for education is through domestic resources. Therefore, as a bank, we put a lot of emphasis in terms of what do we do in terms of strengthening those processes, the systems out there that will make sure that there is an efficient utilization of domestic resources for development, including education. This brings us to the issue of what do we do in terms of ensuring that there is an accountable use, there is a transparent use of resources. And as a bank, we've been doing that for many years. We finance basic education, up to about 2008 to the tune of about 1.2 billion. And from 2008 to the present times, we've changed our emphasis from basic education to higher education, science, and technology. But in all these things, what we try to do is to make sure that putting resources where it matters, and to help on achieve that, increasingly through by a way of trying to support domestic resource mobilization, we have increasingly used what we call budget support operations. The idea here is to make sure that in the course of financing education or any other development operation, be it health, infrastructure, and etc., we make sure that there is a good public financial management system, and that ensures the effective and efficient utilization of the resources we have. And within the bank, we've done that by making sure that we strengthen the revenue streams of government to make sure there are additional resources. This could be in the form of tax reforms that will allow additional financing coming. This could also be in the form of having to make sure that there is expenditure control. Making sure that there is a transparent utilization of the resources. This we have done. We've done that in the form of policy reforms because these are policy-based operations. And we've seen significant progress along those lines.
How have you used the alternative forces, though, to really leverage that investment?
Yeah, what we do in terms of alternative financing is in the form of domestic resource mobilization. As you know, I'm just talking about making sure that we have an efficient utilization of existing resources before touching on the alternative financing. Because first and foremost, we have to make sure that the resources we have are put into effective use. I'm just trying to push that point first. And that is through making sure that we have accountable and transparent processes in place and making sure that there are effective policy reforms as far as public financial management is concerned. Because even if we get additional resources, if we don't have the right systems in place, these resources will not give us the desired outcomes. So one way of doing that is what I'm trying to emphasizing, the use of budget support operations. Then the other stream, that perspective, is in terms of what do we do as a bank to be a catalyst for additional resources. And this is where our other role comes in terms of, with our AAA rating, we are able to use that to leverage additional financing for development operations, including education. For example, we are able to support and make sure that there is an open space for broad-based participation in development work, which includes education. We are able to open up space for the private sector, space for the foundations, as well as space for individuals in the form of the diaspora. In the case of, in terms of opening up space for broader participation, we have introduced several schemes, such as for private sector development. There's a lot of effort being done in terms of private equity funds. We've successfully done that in infrastructure, we've done some in health, and we're thinking of doing more in education. But as you know, our programs are country-driven, but we have the instrument in terms of private equity funds to support operations that will enhance and support private sector participation. In addition to that, I want to talk briefly about the diaspora also, yes, because we feel that they have an active role and stake to play in terms of education financing or broader financing in the context of our developing countries. So in that context, well, again, as a bank, we have carried out several studies in terms of seeing how do we enhance the role of the diaspora as far as financing of development intervention is concerned, including education. And for that, we have assisting some of the countries in also coming up with homegrown strategies so that they can also use that to sort of leverage additional financing coming from the diaspora. A typical example would be use of diaspora bonds to help support it. The other aspect also is the use
I'm going to
of...
stop you there. I'm sure you're getting a lot of ideas. There'll be a lot of questions from the floor, and we'll come back to you definitely. But thanks for that. It's given us a good overview. But let me now turn to Iqbal. I mean, in many ways, as we were talking about before this session, the Aga Khan Foundation and Development Network has been in this business, if you like, for quite a long time, and many consider it to be an alternative source of financing. Say a bit about your experience and how you use your financing more effectively.
Is this on? Oh, good. I thought I might need some education on how to turn a microphone on. It's happened before, so. Well, thank you, Desmond. Yes, as you mentioned, we've been in the activity of providing education for well over 100 years. I was telling Desmond on the way here that when I visited Zanzibar a few years ago and walking down Stone Town, I looked up at a building and it said Aga Khan Girls School 1903. And so we've been in that, and we believe in the ladder of education. So our education really begins, as one of my colleagues mentioned the other day, at the prenatal level, really, because through our health system, we provide prenatal care, postnatal care, but our education, formal education, really begins with the early childhood development programs through primary, secondary, and then tertiary through the 2 universities that we have. In terms of us being seen as an alternative approach to financing within the definition you've given, yes, I accept that. Otherwise, I think if you subscribe to the approach that society as a whole has a responsibility for supporting its own growth and improvement, then I don't think we are alternative. I do subscribe to the thought that the primary responsibility for funding education is that of the government, but it is not its exclusive domain. And let me explain why I say that. For those of us who might have looked at this, the role of the non-state player in the provision of education, particularly primary education, is growing. But it is underappreciated, under-recorded, and not sufficiently supported. If you even look at the perceptions about the private sector's role in education, they vary all over the place. Mostly we think about it as elite schools that cater to the rich and the wealthy and not to the poor. Whereas the fact is that non-state players, whether these are citizen-run organizations, NGOs, private for-profit or private non-profit schools, they cover the whole spectrum, including faith-based organizations like churches providing education. But many of the non-state providers of education are actually providing education to children of low-income families. And more we find that poor families are prepared to pay something for their children's education if they see value in it, if they have better access to education. It allows them to hold the teacher and the school more accountable because they are participating in it. And it also helps improve the provision of services from the government when the community itself is involved. So the role of the community ought not to be discounted in the process of the alternative sources of financing. Between 10 to 40%, depending on the region and the country, of children of school-going age actually go to non-state providers of education. And as I said, it's not sufficiently recorded and not sufficiently documented. A couple or 3 examples from the things that we've experimented with other than direct provision of services. We have a program called the Madrasa Resource Center in East Africa where the communities approached us to bring in secular education into Quranic schools. These are community-based programs that the community runs itself. They decide what kind of theology will be taught and so on. But they were anxious for their children to be competitive when they compete for going to primary schools. And in an effort to make them self-financing, we created the notion of mini endowments, where the community itself would create a small endowment, which would be matched by us and by a grant that each center received when the kids graduated from the Madrasa Resource Center. They decided how that money is to be invested, how much of those proceeds or returns on that investment would go towards paying the teacher's salary, because that was the biggest expense. And over time, they have succeeded, by and large, in making that work. It's gone through its share of ups and downs because they invested in certain kinds of funds. Now they've moved towards investing in real estate where they get rent, so there is some security of income. But it's a small enough example. The other point I want to make about alternate financing that comes from the discussion we had this morning that Sheikh Amoza sponsored about thinking about innovative partnerships and approaches to financing, and she encouraged us not to think just in sector-specific ways. One of the examples I can give you from our own network is we have the Aga Khan University, which, along with its medical school and nursing school and so on, also has diagnostic clinics. The diagnostic clinics create a surplus that funds the cost of the university, or helps fill in the operating cost of the university. So there are several examples like that, but the one point that I do want to leave here and for us to think about, that we don't often think about, because thinking intersectorally, what about the role of family income in all of this? As I mentioned a minute ago, we find that poor families are also prepared to pay for their children's education if they find value in it. We know from our studies and so on that when family income increases, and especially when women's income increases, more of it goes into the family's health and education than otherwise. That is the domestic resource that I think Yero also alluded to.
Very interesting.
Right.
A very interesting alternative source. Thanks, Iqbal. Again, I'm sure we'll come back further questions on your examples. But let me turn now to Dr. Wang. And I mean, you've had direct experience working at scale with the government of China and helping make better use of government resources, I think, essentially, haven't you? But perhaps tell us a bit about that work.
Okay, thank you. It's Wang. Thank you, Desmond. And first of all, it's really a pleasure to be here. And actually, I want to make 3 points. And first point, I want to make a follow-up upon your definition as to what alternative mean. And second, perhaps I should elaborate more on the list of alternatives China has tried, and some of which have been stopped actually. And the third point I want to make is I would caution about the consequences of emphasizing too much upon alternatives to the mainstream government sources. We do have some lessons in China. First of all, about what are the alternatives, because I can't expect some in the audience will definitely ask us about accountability, or the participation of NGO and so on. I kind of feel it's necessary to define what are the alternatives. Alternatives at 3 levels. One is alternatives to from whom to get the money for the education sector. So the question about whom. And second is about mechanism. With what kind of mechanisms to channel the money from financier to the recipient educational institutions. And also, sometimes we actually think like the financial management reforms are actually very, very important in terms of enhancing accountability and so on. So there are 3 levels of alternatives, or 3 levels of reforms. So we need to clarify about that first. And I think for reforms or innovations at different levels, they have different political and technical prerequisites. I feel like when we talk about to identify alternatives to who should, give the money to the education sector, you have to check the whole tax system, the whole fiscal system. It's not in China's experience. It can never be an isolated education reform. It can never be an isolated education financing reform. It's not that a kind of a easy thing, and so that's the first point I want to make.
So let me just be clear. So for you, alternative is about making better use of taxes and the tax system and reforming that. Is that right?
Well, actually, it's not only about that. It's not only about that, because in China, we kind of have experienced some reform in the education financing regime, which I would divide it into 2 stages. And the first stage between 1980s until 2005, that's my own point of view. And it could be characterized as decentralization and diversification. And diversification means that in addition to the mainstream government appropriations from general tax revenues, and the schools and institutions are encouraged to raise money from other sources, and also the government had made a lot of policies. And I can give you a list of such alternatives right now. For instance, a kind of revenue is called I would call quasi-tax, collected specifically for the education sector, including urban education surcharge in our Chinese terminology, rural education surcharge, local education level. Like for instance, the urban education surcharge is levied towards enterprises at 2 to 3% of the total of value-added tax and business tax and consumption tax. And rural education surcharge, which was later stopped, was charged towards rural households at 1 to 2% of the rural per capita household income. And in addition, that's a kind of revenues. And in addition to that, we also have social donations. And indeed, actually, in China, we do have tax relief policies towards those that donate to educational institutions. And very recently, actually, the government made some, not recently, okay, I'll go back to the first stage, okay. But the most important, as I said yesterday with some of my partners, I kind of feel we can characterize our Chinese strategy as use tomorrow's money, use others' money. Actually, our schools borrow very heavily from commercial banks for outlay expenditures. And so that's all kinds of a strategy. But all the alternatives, except tuition and fees, proved not to be so, didn't raise that much money, didn't meet our expectation. And actually, the most important source of revenue, in addition to government appropriations, is tuition and fees, collect directly from students. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, before I throw it open to the floor, what I'm hearing all three of you say is that government financing has to be the main source of financing, particularly for primary and basic education. But I suppose my second question back to you all is really, is there scope for alternative financing of various different kinds to make that money have a greater impact, to help mainstream financing be more effective, promote innovation, promote accountability? Any thoughts on that? Or are we basically just saying, no, it has to be government financing and there isn't really space or value added from alternative sources? Yeri, your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think, of course, there is, a value added in terms of, the alternative financing dimension, especially coming from, the private sector side. We know that the private sector are very good in innovation. Private sector are very good, governance structures. So obviously, bringing in private sector money into the whole education system also has its own added benefit in terms of really, not only in the financing dimension, but also in terms of improving processes and systems within the education system as well.
Have you got examples where the bank has done that?
The bank, we've got, as I said, we've done it in other sectors, not much in education, but obviously the use of, private equity funds is one catalytic way of drawing the private sector, into financing, some interventions in Africa. As you know, obviously, there is always this, concern by some investors in terms of investing in Africa. But the bank, we've effectively used our AAA rating, as I said earlier, in terms of trying to provide comfort to some of these investors in investing. And I can see no reason why it will not work in, education in that particular context.
As yet?
No, we've not yet done any private equity in education per se.
Very good.
But it's a model that can be applied across all sectors.
Okay. Iqbal, what do you think? Is this something that the Aga Khan Development Network explicitly wants to do with your finance? Are you trying to leverage change and improvement in mainstream financing, or is that not really something you're trying to achieve?
No, absolutely. It's a mix of things, and I think one of the errors we need to prevent ourselves from doing is painting things in black and white terms, because the realities of how education is provided, funded, supported, and so on is much more subtle than that. There is a combination of things where you have just government schools run by government, sponsored by them, and funded by them. And they range from that all the way to a mix of public-private partnerships, where the government provides the school facilities, but the local community runs the school, picks the teacher. Teacher training is done by somebody else. So there's a whole range of things, and I think in some cases they're country or even context specific. But we have had experience with all of those. What I do observe from that public-private partnership thing is that there is mutual accountability. It makes the government more accountable and more effective in the use of its resources. And it also holds the private sector more accountable. So I think wherever you have that kind of a partnership, it seems to be a better approach. Again, I'm not recommending that as the only approach, but that seems to be a better approach.
And Ron, from your own experience, I mean, do you think, looking to the future, will we see greater diversification of financing for education in China, or are we going to see continuing it being the tax-based community or central government funded?
Well, actually, I can see in the future, definitely there will be more kind of government appropriations channeled into the education sector. As I mentioned earlier, China has experienced 2 stages of reform. The first stage can be characterized decentralization and diversification. And starting in the year 2005, around that, and we entered another stage, the second stage, which I would call it the re-centralization and the de-diversification. And actually, as a consequence of diversification in the first stage, there have been some negative consequences. For instance, that imposed a serious, heavy burden upon rural farmers. And also the regional disparity and urban versus rural duality, that kind of equity and equality problems were exacerbated. And so in the second stage, we can see, like governments made much more effort to enforce commitments of government at various levels, to prioritize education spending, especially for compulsory education. And also the central government started to take more responsibility for financing recurrent expenditures of our compulsory education schools. But going back to the point you want to make, actually, I think we shouldn't deny that diversification, that kind of education finance regime played a very important role. And during those years, the schools relied heavily upon local communities. And really, communities were very enthusiastic and had, much stronger ownership over schools. And we can see, the recent reform in some cases kind of has some negative impact in that aspect. Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks to our panelists. You've heard a lot of examples, you've heard a lot of experience. I'm sure there are many in the room that have had both experience of receiving and providing alternative sources of financing. So I want to throw it open to the floor now and invite comments, questions, asking you to follow the normal pattern, introduce yourself, your organization, but be brief in your interventions if you don't mind. And then I'll also ask the technicians to reset my iPad so that I can pick up the Twitter comments. So hands up for a first comment.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Dr. Ahmed Al-Sayyad. I'm from Egypt. I have 2 or 3 comments and questions in themselves. I think, first of all...
Please be brief.
Yes, I will. The critical issue that hasn't been addressed is the issue of constitutional right for free education. So if the government finance... it's by law that you need to give free education. So the private monies, alternative finance, etc., will always face this problem. So how is that addressed? That's an issue. It could be private schools, that's fine, that will charge tuition. But if it's for government support, then it has to be free. That's my first question. My second question is regarding the PPP component. It's, again, because of the involvement, the purpose of the PPP has turned in several instances worldwide into facility management rather than PPP in education. The quality of the education, since the same system is choosing the teachers, is doing the education, the private sector is mostly involved with the facility itself. So it turns very much into facility management, which can be a good thing for infrastructure, but not such a good thing for the education quality. My last comment or question is, are education cities worthwhile? I mean, again, with all of these initiatives and problems of legislation and implementation, are collective clusters of education cities useful or not? Thank you.
Education City, very good. I'll take a few more questions and then ask the panelists to respond. Two gentlemen here in the center, one and one. Two microphones at the center, please, if we can. Oh, okay, sorry, one over here.
Merci, je vais parler en français. Mais
I'd
j'ai
like
trois
to
points
speak
qui
in
s'adressent,
French. I have 3
dont deux
points.
s'adressent au docteur Baldé.
Two for Dr.
La-
Balde.
Le premier, je ne sais pas si j'ai mal compris, je suis ministre de l'enseignement supérieur du
Minister of
Congo.
Higher
J'ai
Education of
entendu
Congo.
dire que la BAD,
I heard say
la Banque
that
africaine du
the African
développement,
Development
s'intéressait
Bank
plus
was more
à l'enseignement
interested
fondamental.
in a basic, fundamental
Alors, je me demande
basic
si ce n'est pas la
education.
même erreur
I'm wondering
qu'a commise
whether it's
la
not the
Banque
same
mondiale,
mistake that
ne
the World
s'intéresser qu'à
Bank
l'enseignement
made,
fondamental.
that only
J'espère
focusing
avoir
on
mal
basic
compris.
education only. And I hope
La
I've
deuxième
badly understood
chose qui est une question,
this.
Docteur Baldé, vous
Second,
avez
Dr. Balde,
parlé de
you
financement
spoke
privé,
about private
de
financing,
financement complémentaire
or
ou alternatif, comme
additional
vous
or
le dites.
alternative, as you.
J'ai compris qu'il y a les
called.
ONG,
There's the
il y a
NGOs,
le privé,
the
et vous avez
private
parlé de la
sector,
diaspora.
and you spoke about the diaspora.
Comme nous sommes dans une
Now, since we
séance
are
de
in
bonnes pratiques,
a session
est-ce
talking
qu'on
about
peut
good
illustrer ceci? Est-ce
practices,
qu'il y a
can we
un pays
illustrate this?
africain
Is there
qui
an
a
African country
bénéficié
that
de
has
ces
actually
financements
benefited from
alternatifs
these
ou
alternative financing
complémentaires,
or additional financing,
incluant
including
ces trois partenaires dont vous avez parlé,
3 partners
ONG,
that you spoke about,
privé
NGO,
et,
private,
ou l'un des deux,
or
ou l'un des
one
trois,
of the
si vous-
3, if you like.
Enfin, en éducation.
In
Je parle en
education, not in
éducation
general, in
seulement.
education only.
Enfin,
And
je voudrais vous
finally,
partager
I'd like
des
to
financements complémentaires chez moi.
say that
mon
about something
pays,
about additional
il y a
alternative
aussi
financing
des
in my
individus
country. There
qui
are
participent au
individuals
financement, qui
who
construisent des
participate in
écoles.
financing, who
Souvent,
build
ce sont
schools.
des députés,
They are often
à des
members
visées
of parliament
souvent
who
électoralistes.
do this for electoral
Qu'est-ce que vous en
purposes.
pensez?
What is your opinion?
Merci.
Thank you.
Oh, merci bien.
Thank you.
In the middle, please.
All right. My name is Robert Esprilla. I'm from Colombia, South America, and I work for the Ministry of Interior in Colombia. My job is coordinating cooperation, international cooperation for Black communities in Colombia. I was interested in what Mr. Euro had to say about the possibility that the African Development Bank, would work with the diaspora. Are you talking about the diaspora, the African diaspora around the world, or the diaspora within continent? I'm not sure exactly what you meant by that. Also, wanted to see if the Development Network worked in Latin America, or is it something that's done before in the past, or is something that we're willing to do? And same question for Ms. Wang, Dr. Wang. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. Questions. Yero, I think you had a set of tough questions, so why don't you start? Is the African Development Bank only interested in basic education?
No, okay, let me start. In fact, maybe you, misunderstood me. What I said was up to 2008, the bank was actively involved in basic education. But from 2008, we shifted the emphasis on higher education, science, and technology. And this is where the bank funding is now. In terms of basic education, we still don't ignore it completely. And we are funding basic education through our budget support operations, which obviously allows the government to invest more in education by making sure that we protect some of the investments that are allocated to the education sector. If we find that these there are very good outcomes that can come out of those investments. So, in a nutshell, the bank's focus now is on higher education, science, and technology. In terms of the African country benefiting from financing, obviously, private sector involvement will be more at the tertiary education, that is post-secondary, instead of at the primary basic education level. So since we started working on this higher education, science, and technology, we've seen some interventions which are involved in the private sector. A typical example is Mali. We recently approved what we call a Mali Digital Complex operation, which obviously makes use of ICT and brings in a multinational cooperation in terms of helping to enhance ICT in the context of Mali's education. We also have other like African Virtual University, which relies very much on information technology related types of interventions. So increasingly, we are trying to leverage and bring in the private sector to play a more active role in terms of education. Then on the diaspora, yes. I mean, obviously, what I said is that our role for the diaspora is not like the bank working directly with the diaspora. What we do is more of a catalytic role. We help our regional member countries. Because as you know, as I said earlier, the bank programs are country-driven. If a country wants to engage with the diaspora, we help them to develop a strategy or a mechanism so that they can engage the diaspora more effectively. So far, the countries that we've helped has been dealing with the diaspora largely coming from their own countries.
Thanks. Iqbal, do you want to deal with the question of the constitutional right to free education?
Not sure I'm following.
With your microphone?
Thank you. Knew I was forgetting something. I think, I mean, there's no argument about that when the Constitution is embedded in the UN Charter of Human Rights and so on, and which is why I think the premise we've taken is that funding of education is primarily the responsibility of government, but that doesn't mean others can't have a role in it. I wanted to comment on this, on your question about the PPPs, and yes, it could be at the level of just facility management, but our own experience has shown that it can be more substantive and more meaningful than that. And let me give you one small example from the northern areas in Pakistan, for instance. For many, many years, actually many, many decades, the only schools that provided education for girls were the Aga Khan schools, starting back in the 1940s before Pakistan was even created. And then in more recent times, the government has established schools for girls and boys. But there was still a gap for middle and high school for girls. We worked with the government in order to put in a second shift, the afternoon shift, where we could then run classes for girls at the middle and high school level. And that's an example of us using the government facility, bringing in teachers and bringing in students, actually, who did not have physical facilities to go to in order to leverage them for both. I can go on with examples about teacher training in the same way and teacher accreditation, but there are very many ways to make the PPPs more substantive and more meaningful. So.
A very concrete question about the Aga Khan works in Latin America.
Yes, no, we do not, and I don't think that we have any current plans to expand beyond the areas that we're already covering, which are primarily South and Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa.
Are education cities worthwhile?
I'm really not sure about that. There are a lot of very similar, we call it education parks or education and science and research parks. But I myself, frankly speaking, not so familiar with that. I'm only familiar with very few cases toward which I hold some critical viewpoint. But actually, I want to go to the question raised by the first commentator, because I really agree with you, and I think it's of paramount importance, especially in developing countries, to enforce commitments of government to financing education. And actually in China, we do have some legislations about how to enforce that. Actually, I myself am called 4% lady among my friends, because in China, of #1 education finance researchers' question is how to accomplish the so-called 4% GDP goal, which means actually in the late 1980s, the Chinese government, kind of set up this objective increase of public education expenditure to 4% of GDP. So far, we haven't achieved that yet. Anyway, so we made a lot of legislations. And with that, like People's Congress and so on are entitled to make some inquiries, with our executive branches, impose some political pressures. But still, I kind of think it's still very effective, it's still very effective.
Great, thank you. We've got one question online, which is a tough one. So I'll say, do you think about it, and then I'll give you some time. Of all the different innovative financing mechanisms that are being suggested around the world, which ones do you think are the most sustainable and scalable? So I'll leave that one with you. What do you think? And let me throw it back over to the floor there, please, and take further questions and further suggestions. Yes, microphone here, gentleman here, and gentleman there. So this gentleman here first, please. Please say your name and short question or comment.
My name is Mohammed Diab. I work for World Food Program. I just wanted to ask a very quick question about financing education through taxation, which was discussed earlier. it seems that in each sector in Africa, probably if there are other meeting here on health or on agriculture or whatever, everybody will be going back again and saying, look, this should be financed from agriculture, from taxation. So given the fact that many African resource poor countries, their GDP, even if you fix 10% for agriculture of your GDP and 4% for education and whatever, that 4% or 5%, depending on the very narrow base of the GDP, will not even be sufficient for funding education. And at the same time, health, water, all kind of sectors are now meeting elsewhere and saying it should be funded by education. From where this is going to be really a heavy burden on an average person, and it is not sustainable, and this in way does not create competitiveness of the sector itself if it continuously basing the finance of the sector on by taxation. I'm sorry I came a bit late, but I don't know. We have not, I haven't seen anybody talking about direct support to the government budget, I mean through foreign aid, to support the education sector. Education sector in Africa is lagging far behind all other sectors, or also there is a major inequality between access to education in Africa and elsewhere. How can we close that gap without really putting a further additional burden on an average African to finance its own education? Thank you.
Great question, thank you. Yeah. Gentleman in the middle here.
Good afternoon, Mr. Desmond and panelists and their public. My name is Heiser Ledesma. I'm from Colombia. This question is for Dr. Noor Ali. Good afternoon. When you say government has the primary responsibility for education, I do agree with you, but are there any international policy to press or obligate governments for finance education in developing countries? Am I clear? Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's great. Nick, I think the microphone there, and then one more question down here, and then we'll take another round after this one, okay? Microphone there. Nick.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Nick Burnett from Results for Development. I just wanted to comment on this point about the government should pay, which I completely agree with. But what if the government can't pay? Because, and I think we've been talking as if all countries are the same, but countries are obviously at very different stages of economic, educational, and demographic development. And I think it is very, very difficult for, I mean, if we look at the last decade or so, developing countries, and especially low-income countries, have done really well in terms of increasing their spending on basic education. But they now face the need to continue this basic education, essentially primary education, and now meeting needs at secondary level, all at the same time their populations are continuing to expand very rapidly. So this is a huge thing. And I don't think it's as simple, frankly, as just saying, well, the government should pay, because they're not all able to. So I do think, therefore, it's necessary that we think about alternative sources. So, you know, one thing which some people don't like, but is maybe you do have to charge at least people who can pay, at least for some parts of secondary education. I mean, maybe that's not popular, but if that's the only way to do it, maybe you need to think about it. Second thing is about how to get more resources in. So here's where we come to the alternative financing. So things like bonds and so on, there's a lot of potential for these, both domestically and internationally. And thirdly, things, and we have to be working on some things like this, but things like impact investing, getting people who want to both get some return on their money, but or minor return, maybe 1% or something, but at least preserve their money, but also do good. There are a lot of people around the world now who are very interested in this sort of thing. So I think there are several. The point I want to make is that there are 2 points. One, that governments may not always be able to, and under those circumstances, we need to think both about these alternative sources and also, frankly, about things that some people don't want to hear about, which is charging those who at least can pay.
And Nick, just while you got the microphone, do you want to make the point from your previous session that you were chairing about the link between alternative sources of financing and innovation in the sector? Because that was quite an important point, wasn't it, from the previous session?
Sure. One of the reasons that I think there was a question about aid from somebody, and one of the reasons it's hard to seems to be hard to attract more aid or large amounts from new sources like foundations and so on, is a perception, which may seem a bizarre thing to say at a conference on innovation, a perception that education sector isn't innovative enough. And, why should we put our money into that stodgy education stuff? I mean, I know it sounds an odd thing to say at the WISE conference, but that is a real perception out there. So I think that the idea of linking these alternative sources or innovative sources of financing to the promotion of innovation would help deal with not only promoting of innovation, but also deal with that broader image question, which then in turn would probably release more funds from more conventional sources.
Great, thanks. One more question, then I'll come back to the panel. Front here.
3 questions, if I may.
Quickly.
Desmond, yeah. The first to Mr. Balde. I didn't quite get the rationale for why the bank has shifted from supporting basic education to higher education in Africa. I mean, is that based on indicators for education in general in Africa? And I didn't introduce myself. My name is Imad Sabi. I'm from Oxfam, and I represent the international NGO constituency on the board of the Global Campaign for Education. My second question to Dr. Wang is about China. I just want to be sure that I understood you correctly. You said up to 2005, what happened in China is that policies that were followed led to an exacerbation in equity problems in education, right? In access to education. Is that what you were saying? In any case, my question is, what exactly are the differences between the 2 phases as far as you are concerned? And a general question, speaking about alternative finances, of course, one important issue that is being discussed now in connection with the financial transaction tax and other sources, there are ideas, concrete ideas. The working group on innovative financing has put forward proposals on how innovative financing can also be used to support education. So what is your reaction on those kinds also of initiatives? Thanks.
Maybe Ron will start with you then. Firstly, the very specific question on China, but then any other questions that you wanted to answer?
There are huge difference between these 2 phases, and actually I want to clarify first, which I just mentioned. The first stage can be characterized as diversification and decentralization. In terms of decentralization, that means that the responsibility to finance and operate schools went down to the lowest level of the governments. There are 5 levels of government, like lowest like township, grassroots township government and the county government with very, very limited fiscal capacity. And for the second stage, which I could say re-centralization and the diversification, means that the government appropriations play much more important role in financing education, and also the central government plays a much more important role in financing compulsory education schools. And actually, I have to confess, I think in developing countries there are not that many alternatives. There are not that many alternatives, and so in the first stage, we really have to rely a lot upon tuition and fees collected directly from students. That proved to be the most reliable source of revenue for our schools. Somehow it really increased dramatically private costs of education. And so for the second stage, and I would agree with that commentator, saying that, and it's like the reform in the education financing regime is really kind of depend upon, the whole the whole fiscal reform, and with the increase of fiscal capacity of government, such education finance reforms only then, kind of could be, successful, could be, kind of talked about. And so we kind of switched, the pendulum in China switched to another side, because now our fiscal revenues of government have been increasing dramatically. So we're now able to draw more upon government sources to finance our schools. Yeah.
Point wrong. I mean, we are increasingly seeing, aren't we, the government of China investing in education, not just in China, but in other countries around the world. Do you see that as a growing trend?
I really don't know. But I have to say, right before I came here, I did some field study in a very remote rural area. Definitely, I do think a lot of our schools are poorly equipped, not adequately staffed with, better trained teachers. And also, when we talk about ICT, and still a luxury for such rural schools. And so I would still insist that our government should continue to increase government appropriations towards our, compulsory education schools instead of channeling money overseas.
Iqbal, let me turn to you. This question of what if the government can't pay? And in particular, next question of, as governments expand their secondary education systems, should we be looking for alternative financing there?
Well, I think the question directly to me was, are there any international policies to compel governments to pay if they don't pay, if I understood the question correctly. I don't know that there are. I think each government is sovereign. I think that's a question better posed to my colleague from the multilaterals, because they have the levers through persuasion when they help set them the budgetary and fiscal policies to make that happen. But I don't think the private sector can, because as I said, the governments are sovereign after all. I don't see government as being the sole provider of funding for education. I mean, that's why we need these other forms. But the primary responsibility in that sense must remain with governments, who is not off the hook. I think the question that somebody else asked here, what about support from alternative sources for budgetary support to governments? I frankly don't see the private sector putting in money into government budgets. I can see IFIs doing that, they do that already. But I think there are ways that we've seen how you can make the government's budget more effective in the way it is utilized, either through improvement in their own sort of methods of evaluation, in helping them set up good statistical records, in helping the teachers get trained better, and so on and so forth. And also, when you work with government, you end up having some influence over education policy through a demonstration effect. It might take a while, you have to have patience, but when it's proven to be effective, most governments will pay attention to it and adopt it as policy, as we've seen in the case of Pakistan and early childhood development, for instance.
Thank you. Yero, you had some very specific questions addressed to you.
Let me start with why the bank shifted from basic to higher education. I think it's more of a selectivity issue. It's a strategic issue, because this happened in 2008. I mean, when the bank commissioned a high-level panel report in terms of where the bank should go in terms of coming up with a strategic plan. And what came out of the report was that, yes, education is important and basic education is still important. We need to do something on it, but the bank would have a comparative advantage if they invest in higher education and science and technology, especially in terms of enhancing the competitiveness and productivity of the African economies. So this became the main base for it. But as I said earlier, we are not saying that we cannot support basic education, but we do it through some of our financing instruments, like budget support, by providing additional resources to the budgets of this government, which gives them sort of the latitude to invest more in basic education. And in some cases, depending on the policy reforms that we agree with the government, it could be such that we might even protect those budgetary allocations that are going towards basic education. So
let me come back then to the question online and ask all three of you to give your thoughts on this. So of all the various different kinds of innovative forms of financing that we've talked about here and in other sessions, is there anyone that's jumped out at you as both sustainable and scalable? Any thoughts? Iqbal?
Yes, the first one is speculative because it hasn't been tried in a sufficient volume. And to me, that's blended financing. It is a combination of money that is in equity, in debt, in concessional loans and grants that can help pay the relatively high cost of building the infrastructure for education. And that's not just the physical infrastructure, it's also the soft infrastructure, teacher training colleges, the ICT behind it. And that can effectively reduce the cost of it. So I see blended financing as being sort of a viable way forward that can pay for things like higher education. By the way, I wanted to comment on that. I think I've advocated for many years in Washington that when we only pay attention to basic education and ignore higher education, we are basically saying to developing countries that we are setting the glass ceiling for how high you can go, that you don't deserve to be better educated and create your own leadership. So I'm delighted to hear that the African Development Bank is paying attention to that, but hopefully not at the exclusion of the others. My second point would be what I said before, and I think that is not speculative, that has been proven. We have to create economic growth for countries. We have to expand the pie rather than think about distributing the pie that it is at the moment. Because when families have more access to income, when their incomes grow, more of it goes into health and education. They want to educate their kids. So those are the two sort of ways in which I would respond to that question online.
So blended financing, better economic growth. Yuri?
Yeah, I think I agree very much with Iqbal. I mean, obviously, to be more, sustainable and scalable, we need to go into investments that, increases the leveraging effect for some of the investments that we do. And obviously, public-private partnership gives us that opportunity. And also, obviously, in terms of learning outcomes as well, I think they become greater because, as I said, it's not only the financing aspect that you look at, but what comes with that financing in terms of best practices that goes with it. So I think it is a very, sustainable way. But then we don't lose sight of the fact that, obviously, the most predictable and sustainable financing mechanism is the one that is coming from our domestic resources. And this has to be the tax-based, receipts that go into education.
What about diaspora bonds for education? $300 billion of diaspora money flowing around the world. Shouldn't we be tapping into that?
Yeah, but of course, this is, there is a high potential. But we need to make sure that we have the right environment for it at the level of the countries. In some of the fragile states, there's a big motivation for them to go for the diaspora. But we know that they have serious challenges in terms of capacity, but also in terms of, getting the required systems and structures in place to make good use of these diaspora funds. So it's a way of really, the potentials are there, but the challenges to help us realize those potentials are great.
Wrong. Any ideas that are jumping out at you as sustainable and scalable alternative sources of financing?
Yeah, I don't think I have any inspiring ideas. As I just said, especially for post-compulsory education institutions, perhaps you really to be, to some extent, self-reliant. And with more self-reliance, perhaps more autonomy would come. Yeah, that's my point.
We've got 10 minutes left, so I think chance for just one more round of questions. So, gentleman here, and the microphone there, and a microphone here. So, gentleman here in the center. And 1, 2, 3, 4.
Thank you. I'm Paul Kolditz, CEO of the Federation of Governing Bodies of South African Schools, obviously in South Africa. I think my question is to Dr. Wang, seeing as that she mentioned tuition fees. And just a brief context, our constitution in South Africa doesn't make provision for free basic education. It guarantees the right to basic education. But it prohibits discrimination on the inability to afford school fees. So 40% of the public schools in South Africa are entitled to charge school fees, and those who can afford must pay the tuition fees, even for basic education. Is there any evidence that there is a correlation between payment of tuition fees and the quality of the school or the quality of the education in the school?
Sir. Madam, sorry.
Alimata Ouad, professeure à l'université, enseignante et chercheur. Dans le débat, il y a un point important que je ne retrouve pas et pour lequel d'ailleurs le secteur privé s'intéresse à l'éducation, c'est l'innovation, la recherche, c'est-à-dire l'aboutissement de cette éducation vers du social, du travail, etc. Or, ce financement de la recherche n'existe pas dans les pays en voie de développement et de moins en moins. Et ce problème n'a pas été posé. Je veux dire également ajouter une autre chose, c'est que quand on dit que les institutions n'imposent pas, les institutions imposent. La Banque mondiale a imposé l'éducation primaire et secondaire, les pays ont fait des efforts, des écoles ont été construites, les enfants ont eu le baccalauréat. Ils veulent rentrer à l'université, il n'y a pas de place. Parce qu'il n'y a pas d'infrastructure construite, parce que la recherche s'en va, il n'y a rien, et ensuite on applique des réformes. Donc tout ça, ce sont des problèmes. Et je ne pense pas que le développement des solutions alternatives, il y en ait une. Il y a probablement à réfléchir sur plusieurs solutions alternatives en tenant compte de la spécificité des pays.
Panacea here.
Et
You
je
need
pense
to
que ça
find different
manque un
solutions
petit peu
for
au
different
débat,
countries
le
and different
financement de la
problems.
recherche.
And
Je
I
vous
believe
remercie.
that this hasn't been taken into account, the importance of funding research.
Merci.
Thank you very much.
Monsieur Miekom Jean-Marc,
Monsieur Malcolm Jean-Marc,
l'enseignement supérieur au Gabon.
in charge of higher education in teacher in higher education in Gabon. I would have a few questions, cultural questions. First of all, on the issue of development assistance, this is a question for the BAD. We would like the African Development Bank to give us concrete examples of development assistance in the area of education. So, one example in Africa. Second question, about guarantees. Are there any legally binding decisions that require monitoring and follow-up of funding in this area? Do you have any guarantee mechanisms, safeguard mechanisms to make sure that the project is finalized? Those are the two questions I wanted to ask.
Please. And I'm afraid we're going to have to make this the last question, and I'll ask the panelists to answer in short term, and then we'll have a sum up. So,
Shams Qasim Laka, former founding president of Aga Khan University, and currently I'm also chairing the board of the Pakistan Center for Philanthropy. I don't have a question for the panel, but I was not able to get any sense from the panel or from the others that one of the most usual form of alternative financing is philanthropy. Now, you asked me, you asked the audience and the panel about sustainable and scalable. Philanthropy is both sustainable and scalable. The way European and particularly North American education is funded is through a very good proportion coming from philanthropy. I can just speak from my country in Pakistan. Over the last 6 years or 7 years that we have been keeping statistics of publicly listed companies that give money to philanthropy. That has increased by 10-fold in 6 years. And Pakistan is not the most prosperous country in the world. If you look at the center of economic gravity moving east to the developing countries of Asia particularly, there is so much money available to be tapped into for philanthropy. And I'm not saying that all philanthropy goes into education, but I also know that health and education are the two most important attraction areas for philanthropy. So I would simply say, as you look at alternative financing, start talking to the people who have made a little money. They don't have to be multimillionaires to give. They could give maybe $100, maybe $1,000 worth of support every year. And alumni who have graduated from a college or from a school even will give money. So I think, to me, that is a proven source of support we should perhaps look more into. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Perhaps just while you have the microphone, I mean, the topic of philanthropy as a potential source of finance has come up in several sessions the past 2 days, and I think there's a strong feeling that actually education sector has not been as successful as the health sector, say, has in attracting large-scale investment. You've obviously been successful in Pakistan. What's the secret, do you think? How can we attract more?
The answer is not complicated. Wherever there are people who have made money, nobody ever wants to part with his money because they put a lot of hard sweat and toil and sleepless nights to make that money. So before they give money to me or you or anyone else, they need to be sure that that money is going to be well utilized. Ergo, there is a deficit of trust. Where the deficit narrows and people have confidence in the, let's say, the NGO or the school or the hospital that is going to use their money effectively, there will be much more giving. Okay? Accountability and trust is very important.
Very good answer. Thank you. Back to the panel. I'll leave you to choose the questions that you want to answer. Yero, you had some specific ones addressed to you as the African Development Bank.
I will try to answer the one on the support research, which I think is a very valid observation. In actual fact, the bank's strategy for higher education is one of the pillars of it is for us to support, help in establishing centers of excellence in Africa. And I think we are having to, we have started seeing that happening in some of the countries that we have supported so far. So obviously there is a focus in terms of what do we do to enhance, knowledge work in Africa. Because increasingly, we have seen that, obviously, even in the international discourse, the African voice is becoming more prominent. And this can even get better if we invest more in research and development in Africa. So this is something that the bank recognizes and is something that is very central to the bank's strategy for higher education, science and technology. With regards to, specific examples on some of the higher education, obviously we've supported several. One of them, if I can just mention, is the African University of Science and Technology, which is based in Nigeria and also in Burkina Faso. We've recently also supported Rwanda with an ICT Center of Excellence in partnership with the Carnegie Mellon University. So these are just some of the examples that we are doing in the support of higher education, especially in relation to science and technology as well. I cannot agree more with the observation and comment on the use of philanthropies as an alternative source of financing. And in fact, I think the bank has recognized this, and we are currently in discussion with the Aga Khan Foundation in terms of seeing how we can help establish sort of an East African university looking at medical education within the East African region. But sometimes the difficulty is trying to get, as you know, our programs are country-driven. So those discussions are going on, and we are sure that, with the participation of Aga Khan Foundation, we'll be able to leverage the resources we have and reach out to more countries within that region, especially in medical education at the level of the university within that region.
Good, thank you. Iqbal, last answers or last thoughts from you?
I could not understand the questions that were asked in French. I apologize because I don't have the device that translates. So, but I will, and I'm grateful to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Qasim Laka, for bringing up the philanthropy, which is something I was going to say in my concluding remark, but he explained it much more eloquently. I completely agree with that. And it links in also to the factor of economic growth. So in my concluding, in response and conclusion, I would say governments have a role in creating an enabling environment for the private sector to be more effective and to work mutually for mutual accountability and more effectiveness. I think the non-state player needs to be recognized better through research, but also be included in the country strategies and plans that are made, because presently not very many countries take that into account, and after all, they are a contributor to the provision of education, and particularly to improving the quality of education in the countries. So I think they need to be accounted for and have a voice in the country plans and strategies. I think More research needs to be done. I think in terms of new ways of financing and funding, as we heard in the morning session, in the education sector, not very much new has been tried. But that doesn't mean there are no opportunities for doing that. In my mind, the blended financing approach that you just mentioned, which is part of what we are discussing with the ADB and other multilaterals, might well be the way to go. And I think, bottom line, if people have more money in their pockets, especially poor people, they'll spend it on health, they'll spend it on education. So let's not think about education as an isolated sector by itself. Let's think about development in a more comprehensive and holistic way.
Dr. Wang, last thoughts, last answers?
Yes, I want to first of all make a comment on the philanthropy in developing countries. Actually, I myself on the board of a very famous NGO in China, and on that board there's some richest people in China as well as some leading thought leaders in China. I can see, first of all, especially in country like China, we need to have a nurturing policy environment, enabling environment. You know, like people contribute, they certainly want to have some say over the governance of educational institutions when they are denied such opportunities, and people's enthusiasm would be, you know, kind of negatively impacted. And second, I think that in China also, these philanthropy efforts could be linked with ideology-oriented groups, and sometimes, you know, like they would run into some obstacles. And going back to the question about tuition and fees, I think that's a very, very important question. It's like when we talk about, you know, like education financing in China with some, especially some Western scholars, they would say, you know, like you're from Peking University or Tsinghua University, two of the top universities, how come you charge such low tuition, you know? And then that means like government subsidize these elite institutions and these kids mostly from well-to-do families. That's so unfair, you know. So I think that is something that's really some challenge. And going back about how China launched this, we call it cost recovery or cost sharing policies, I do think in developing countries, it demands some political will as well as you have to do it in a very skillful way. In China, usually we have adopted like differentiated tuition schemes. You know, for instance, like for higher education institutions, at the beginning, we use a two-track tuition schemes. You know, for those whose entrance scores kind of are high enough, they were not charged. But for those with lower scores, and they were charged. And gradually, the two-track kind of turned into one track. Every student was required to be charged. And, you know, it's like requires some skillful maneuvering in the whole process. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Sadly, we're going to have to finish there for now because time has run out. But just to say thanks to you in the audience and those online that have sent in questions, and thanks particularly to the panel for a great discussion. I think we got lots of ideas and lots more questions to ask. But please just join me in thanking the panel. Thank you.